Samantha Chen, a seasoned flight attendant, delivers a shocking slap across the face of Dr. Aaliyah Richardson, an elegantly dressed black woman in first class. The cabin falls silent. Security rushes forward. What Samantha doesn't know is that this woman owns the entire airline, and her single action will unravel everything she believes about power, privilege, and her own future in ways she never imagined possible. Before we dive into this incredible true story that shook an entire industry, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready for a story that will completely change how you think about assumptions and consequences, smash that like button and hit subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories. Trust me, what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. Let's jump right into how one moment of hatred collided with justice in the most unexpected way. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as Flight MA447 prepared for its cross-country journey to Los Angeles. Dr. Aaliyah Richardson walked purposefully through the terminal, her designer, heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from building a tech empire worth over $3 billion. But today, she wasn't traveling as the celebrated entrepreneur the world knew. Today, she was traveling incognito, conducting one of her surprise inspections of Meridian Airlines, the company she secretly owned through a complex web of holding companies. Aaliyah had built her fortune revolutionizing artificial intelligence in healthcare. But her acquisition of Meridian Airlines 2 years prior had been a strategic diversification move. What her board didn't know was that she regularly traveled, on her own flights, observing operations from the passenger perspective. She believed you couldn't truly understand your business unless you experienced it as your customers did. As she approached Gate B12, Aaliyah adjusted her silk scarf and checked her first-class boarding pass one final time. Seat 2A. She'd specifically chosen the window seat to have an unobstructed view of crew interactions throughout the cabin. Her notebook was tucked discreetly in her purse, ready to document any service issues or operational inefficiencies she might observe. Samantha Chen had been working this route for 15 years, and she prided herself on maintaining order in her cabin. At 38, she'd seen every type of passenger imaginable, and she'd developed what she considered an excellent radar for troublemakers. When she saw the well-dressed black woman approaching first class, something immediately triggered her suspicions. In her experience, people who looked like that didn't usually belong in the premium cabin. "Excuse me, ma'am," Samantha intercepted Aaliyah before she could reach her seat. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass and identification." Aaliyah paused, slightly surprised by the abrupt challenge, but maintained her composure. "Of course," she replied smoothly, retrieving both documents from her leather handbag. "Here you are." Samantha examined the boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "This seat is in first class," she stated slowly, as if Aaliyah might not understand the implications. "Yes, that's correct," Aaliyah responded calmly. "Is there a problem?" "Well," Samantha hesitated, clearly fishing for an issue. "Sometimes people get confused about their seat assignments. Are you sure this ticket is yours?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several other passengers were now watching the interaction, their conversations dying down as they sensed the tension building. Aaliyah felt the familiar sting of racial profiling, but she'd learned long ago that losing her temper only gave people like Samantha more ammunition. "I'm quite certain," Aaliyah replied, her voice steady despite the growing irritation. "I purchased this ticket myself 3 days ago." Samantha's jaw tightened. She'd been hoping for a different response, perhaps some confusion or admission of error that would justify her suspicions. Instead, this woman was calm, articulate, and clearly belonged exactly where she was supposed to be. This only made Samantha more determined to find fault. "ID looks interesting," Samantha muttered, examining Aaliyah's driver's license with unnecessary intensity. "California address. Long way from home." "I travel frequently for business," Aaliyah explained patiently, though she was beginning to recognize the pattern of microaggressions she'd encountered countless times throughout her career. Other first-class passengers were beginning to board around them, creating a small traffic jam as Samantha continued her unnecessarily thorough examination of perfectly valid documents. A distinguished older white gentleman in an expensive suit brushed past them without being asked for any identification whatsoever. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. "Ma'am, if you could just step aside for a moment," Samantha suggested, her tone taking on an authoritative edge. "I need to verify something with the gate agent." "That won't be necessary," Aaliyah responded firmly but politely. "My documentation is in order, and I'd like to get settled before takeoff." The standoff continued for several uncomfortable moments. Aaliyah could see other passengers exchanging glances, some looking sympathetic, others seeming to side with the flight attendant's excessive caution. She made mental notes about the situation, recognizing this as exactly the type of discriminatory behavior she'd been hoping to identify and eliminate from her airline. Finally, Samantha stepped aside with obvious reluctance. "Fine," she said, curtly, "but I'll be keeping an eye on things." As Aaliyah settled into her seat, she couldn't help but notice how Samantha's demeanor changed completely when greeting the white passengers who followed. Warm smiles, helpful assistance with luggage, and genuine welcome replaced the cold suspicion she'd received. The double standard was so blatant it was almost comedic, if it weren't so deeply troubling. Aaliyah pulled out her phone and began documenting the incident, typing detailed notes about the encounter. She'd dealt with discrimination throughout her career, but experiencing it as a customer in her own airline felt particularly surreal. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being treated as an unwelcome intruder in a business she owned completely. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Aaliyah tried to focus on her work, reviewing quarterly reports on her laptop. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be far more eventful than she'd planned. Samantha's hostile attitude seemed to be intensifying rather than subsiding, and Aaliyah had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. As flight MA447 reached cruising altitude, Aaliyah opened her laptop and began reviewing the quarterly performance reports that had prompted this surprise inspection in the first place. Customer satisfaction scores had been declining, and now she was beginning to understand why. The spreadsheet showed concerning patterns and complaint categories, with a disproportionate number related to staff attitude and discriminatory treatment. Seeing it firsthand was far more illuminating than any corporate report could convey. Samantha reappeared in the first-class cabin, accompanied by Marcus Thompson, the senior flight attendant. Marcus was a 45-year-old black man who'd been with Meridian for 12 years, and Aaliyah immediately sensed his discomfort with the situation. His body language suggested he'd been reluctantly dragged into something he wanted no part of. "Ma'am," Samantha addressed Aaliyah with exaggerated formality, "I've been receiving complaints from other passengers about disruptive behavior." Aaliyah looked up from her laptop, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what disruptive behavior? I've been sitting quietly, working on my computer." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the absurdity of the accusation. He'd observed Aaliyah throughout the flight and seen nothing remotely disruptive. In fact, she'd been one of the quietest, most polite passengers he'd encountered. "Well," Samantha continued, her voice growing louder to ensure other passengers could hear, "some people have expressed concerns about suspicious activity. Typing on computers, taking pictures, making notes, it's making people nervous." The accusation was so ridiculous that Aaliyah almost laughed. "Taking notes? You mean business traveler behavior that happens on every single flight? Don't get smart with me," Samantha snapped, dropping any pretense of professional courtesy. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I know trouble when I see it." Marcus finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Samantha, this passenger hasn't done anything wrong. She's been completely appropriate." Samantha whirled on her colleague with fury. "Are you questioning my judgment, Marcus? Because last I checked, cabin safety was my responsibility." The exchange was attracting increasing attention from other passengers. The man in seat 1A, a wealthy-looking businessman, craned his neck to get a better view of the confrontation. Two women across the aisle whispered to each other while stealing glances at Aaliyah. The atmosphere in the cabin was becoming electric with tension. Aaliyah maintained her composure despite the growing humiliation. She'd faced down hostile boardrooms, aggressive competitors, and skeptical investors throughout her career. She wasn't going to be intimidated by a flight attendant with obvious issues, even if the situation was becoming increasingly surreal. "Perhaps you could explain exactly what suspicious behavior you're referring to," Aaliyah asked calmly, "because I'd like to understand the specific concern." "The specific concern," Samantha replied with dripping sarcasm, "is that you don't belong here, and everyone knows it. This is first class, not some bus where you can just do whatever you want." The racial undertones weren't subtle anymore. They were blatant, hanging in the air like smoke. Marcus looked mortified, clearly understanding the legal and professional implications of what was happening. Several passengers were now openly staring, some pulling out phones to record the increasingly hostile encounter. Aaliyah reached into her purse and withdrew another form of identification. "Here's my Meridian Airlines Platinum status card. I'm one of your most frequent customers." Samantha barely glanced at the card. "Anyone can fake these things. I've seen it before. People trying to game the system, upgrade themselves illegally, cause problems for legitimate passengers." "Samantha," Marcus intervened more forcefully, "this is getting out of hand. This passenger has valid documentation and hasn't violated any policies." "Stay out of this, Marcus," Samantha warned, "unless you want to explain to the captain why you're interfering with security protocols." The threat was clear, and Marcus reluctantly stepped back. Aaliyah could see the internal struggle in his eyes. He knew what was happening was wrong, but he also knew that challenging Samantha could cost him his job. The power dynamics at play were complex and troubling. Captain Robert Hayes' voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Los Angeles airspace. Aaliyah realized with growing concern that the situation was escalating rather than resolving. She'd hoped that Samantha's hostility would eventually burn itself out, but instead it seemed to be feeding on itself, growing stronger with each interaction. "I want you moved to economy class," Samantha declared suddenly. "There are open seats back there where you'll be more comfortable." The demand was outrageous. Aaliyah had paid for first-class service, presented valid documentation, and done absolutely nothing wrong. The request wasn't just discriminatory, it was actively illegal under federal aviation regulations. "I'll be staying in my assigned E-CHO seat," Aaliyah replied firmly. "The seat I paid for, with valid documentation you've already verified." "We'll see about that," Samantha muttered ominously before stalking away toward the front of the cabin. Aaliyah turned to Marcus, who remained nearby, his face a mask of professional concern mixed with personal anguish. "Does this happen often?" she asked quietly. Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between honesty and self-preservation. "More than it should," he finally admitted in a whisper. "I'm sorry about this. It's not right." As Aaliyah returned to her work, she found herself unable to concentrate on the financial reports. Instead, she was mentally cataloging every aspect of this encounter for the inevitable legal proceedings that would follow. She'd built her fortune by being methodical, thorough, and strategic. Those same skills would serve her well in ensuring that what was happening to her never happened to another passenger on her airline. The flight was still 45 minutes from landing, but Aaliyah had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Samantha's behavior was escalating in a pattern she'd seen before in corporate environments. When someone realizes they've overplayed their hand, they often double down rather than backing away. And in this case, doubling down could lead to consequences that would shock everyone involved. As the aircraft began its initial descent toward Los Angeles, Aaliyah made what would prove to be a fateful decision. She'd been documenting the discriminatory treatment she'd received, and now she felt compelled to take action, not just for herself, but for every passenger who might face similar treatment in the future. She scrolled through her contacts and found the direct number for Meridian Airlines corporate headquarters. Samantha returned to the first-class cabin, her face flushed with anger and determination. She'd spent the last 20 minutes stewing over the situation, convinced that she was dealing with a troublemaker who was trying to embarrass her in front of her colleagues. In her mind, she'd transformed from aggressor to victim, a mental gymnastics routine that would have been impressive if it weren't so dangerous. "Ma'am," Samantha's voice cut through the cabin noise like a blade. "I need to speak with you immediately." Aaliyah looked up from her phone, where she'd been composing a detailed message to her legal team. "What can I help you with?" "You can help by explaining why you've been making threatening phone calls," Samantha accused, her voice loud enough to ensure every passenger in first class could hear. "I know you've been calling people, probably trying to get me fired." The accusation was both accurate and completely inappropriate. Aaliyah had indeed been in contact with her team, but the idea that a passenger couldn't make phone calls or file complaints was absurd beyond measure. "I'm exercising my right to contact customer service about discriminatory treatment," Aaliyah replied calmly. "That's not threatening, that's accountability." What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion, yet happened so quickly that nobody could intervene. Samantha's face contorted with rage as she processed Aaliyah's words. The mention of discrimination and accountability triggered something primal in her, a fear that her carefully constructed world of authority and control was crumbling around her. "You people always play the race card," Samantha snarled, her voice dripping with 15 years of accumulated resentment. "Always trying to get hard-working Americans fired with your fake complaints and victim mentality." The cabin fell silent except for the steady hum of the engines. Every passenger was now watching, sensing that they were witnessing something that would cross a line from uncomfortable to criminal. Marcus had been helping passengers in the rear of first class, but he began moving forward, recognizing the dangerous escalation in Samantha's behavior. Aaliyah stood slowly, gathering her belongings with deliberate calm. She'd heard enough racist tirades in her lifetime to recognize when someone had moved beyond reason into pure hatred. Her priority now was de-escalation and documentation, ensuring that this incident would lead to meaningful change rather than just personal vindication. "I'm going to file a comprehensive complaint about this interaction," Aaliyah stated clearly, her voice carrying throughout the cabin. "This treatment is unacceptable and likely illegal." Those words proved to be the final trigger. Samantha's world collapsed into a tunnel of rage and desperation. She saw her 15-year career flashing before her eyes, her authority being challenged by someone she'd convinced herself didn't deserve respect. In a moment of pure, unfiltered hatred, she drew back her hand and delivered a stunning slap across Aaliyah's face. The sound of palm meeting cheek rang through the cabin like a gunshot. Aaliyah's head snapped to the side, her cheek immediately reddening from the force of the blow. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The shock was so complete, so unexpected, that passengers sat frozen in their seats, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Then chaos erupted. "Oh my God!" gasped the woman in seat 3B, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. "Did she just hit a passenger?" demanded the businessman in 1A, already reaching for his phone. "This is insane!" shouted someone from the back of first class. Marcus broke into a run, covering the distance to Aaliyah's seat in 3 quick strides. "Samantha, what have you done?" But Samantha wasn't finished. The physical release of violence had only intensified her fury, not satisfied it. "She was threatening me," she screamed at the gathering crowd of passengers. "You all saw it." She was being aggressive and threatening. The lies poured out of her mouth like water from a broken dam, each one more desperate than the last. She grabbed Aaliyah's arm roughly, as if to restrain her, but Marcus intervened immediately. "Don't touch her again," Marcus commanded, his professional demeanor cracking to reveal the outrage underneath. "Step away right now." Aaliyah touched her stinging cheek, feeling the heat radiating from where Samantha's hand had connected. The physical pain was minimal compared to the emotional assault, but the symbolic violence was devastating. In 42 years of life, including growing up as a black woman in America and fighting her way to the top of the tech industry, she'd never been struck by someone in a position of authority. Captain Hayes's voice crackled over the intercom with urgent authority. "Flight attendants to stations immediately. We have a situation in the cabin." Passengers were pulling out phones, recording the aftermath of the assault, capturing Samantha's continued tirade and Aaliyah's composed response to being attacked. The video footage would later become crucial evidence, but in the moment, It felt like the entire world was watching her humiliation. "Air marshals to first class," Marcus called. Over the cabin intercom, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We need security assistance immediately." What Samantha didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Aaliyah's earlier phone call hadn't been to customer service or even to a lawyer. She'd called her personal assistant, Jennifer Walsh, with a simple coded message. "It's time." Those two words had set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just this flight, but the entire airline industry. Before you find out what those mysterious words actually meant and how they'll change everything for Samantha, let me ask you this. Do you think Samantha's behavior was just individual racism or a sign of deeper systemic problems? Comment number 1 if you believe this represents a larger pattern that needs to be addressed industry-wide. And if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat like it should be, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. The question everyone's asking is, what could possibly make this situation any more dramatic? Well, you're about to find out in the most shocking way possible. The arrival of 2 federal air marshals in first class transformed the chaotic scene into something resembling organized law enforcement. Agent Sarah Martinez and Agent James Foster had been seated in different sections of the aircraft, monitoring the flight as part of routine security protocols. They'd heard Marcus's call and witnessed the tail end of the confrontation, giving them immediate credibility as neutral observers. "Everyone please remain calm and stay in your seats," Agent Martinez announced, her badge clearly visible as she approached the scene. "We're going to sort this out quickly and professionally." Samantha's demeanor shifted instantly from aggressive to defensive as she realized the gravity of her situation. Federal agents didn't get involved in simple passenger disputes. They got involved when federal crimes had been committed, and assaulting a passenger during a commercial flight was definitely a federal crime. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," Samantha began, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "This passenger was being threatening and aggressive. I was defending myself when she attacked me." Agent Foster was already taking notes, his experienced eye noting the physical evidence. Aaliyah stood calmly with a reddened handprint clearly visible on her left cheek. Samantha showed no signs of physical contact whatsoever. The story she was telling didn't match the evidence in front of them. "Ma'am," Agent Martinez addressed Aaliyah professionally, "can you tell us what happened here?" Aaliyah's response was measured and precise, the result of decades of high-stakes business negotiations where every word mattered. She recounted the entire incident chronologically, from the initial boarding challenge through the escalating harassment to the final physical assault. Her account was detailed, consistent, and delivered without emotion or embellishment. Meanwhile, passengers throughout first class were volunteering to provide witness statements. The businessman in 1A, who introduced himself as Robert Chen, no relation to Samantha, was particularly vocal in his support of Aaliyah's version of events. "I saw the whole thing," he told Agent Foster. "This flight attendant was harassing this woman from the moment she boarded. The slap was completely unprovoked. I've got video of the aftermath if you need it." Similar statements came from multiple witnesses, each corroborating Aaliyah's account and contradicting Samantha's claims of self-defense. The evidence was overwhelming and clearly documented. Captain Hayes arrived in first class, his face grave as he assessed the situation. At 58, he'd been flying commercial aircraft for 30 years and had never dealt with anything remotely like this. A crew member assaulting a passenger was unprecedented in his experience. "What's the status?" he asked Agent Martinez, quietly. "We have a clear case of assault by your crew member against a passenger," she replied. "Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and probably video documentation. This is going to require a full federal investigation." Captain Hayes felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just a personnel issue or a customer service problem. This was a criminal matter that would involve the FBI, the FAA, and probably the Department of Justice. The airline would face massive liability, regulatory sanctions, and public relations catastrophe. What Captain Hayes didn't know was that his assessment of the situation was about to become infinitely more complicated. As he spoke with the air marshals, Aaliyah was making another phone call, this one to Jennifer Walsh, with more specific instructions. "The situation has escalated beyond what we discussed," Aaliyah said quietly into her phone. "Initiate crisis protocol immediately. Contact David Martinez in security and have him meet us at LAX. Also, prepare the legal team for federal coordination." Jennifer Walsh, Aaliyah's executive assistant for the past 8 years, understood the coded language perfectly. Crisis protocol meant that Aaliyah's identity as the owner of Meridian Airlines was about to become relevant to an active situation. It was a contingency they'd planned for, but never expected to use. "Understood," Jennifer replied. "David is already en route to LAX. Legal team is standing by. Should I contact the board?" "Not yet," Aaliyah decided. "Let's see how this plays out first." Marcus Thompson found himself in an impossible position. As senior flight attendant, he was responsible for crew discipline and passenger safety. But he was also a witness to a criminal assault committed by his subordinate. His 15 years with the airline had prepared him for medical emergencies, security threats, and mechanical failures. Nothing had prepared him for this. "Marcus," Captain Hayes called him aside, "I need your honest assessment of what happened here." Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would effectively end Samantha's career and possibly his own. "Captain, Samantha assaulted that passenger without provocation. I witnessed the entire escalation, and it was completely unjustified. She's been displaying discriminatory behavior throughout the flight." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence for Samantha's employment prospects. Captain Hayes knew that Marcus was putting his own job at risk by contradicting a fellow crew member, which made his testimony even more credible. Agent Martinez approached Aaliyah with a standard witness statement form. "Ma'am, I know this has been traumatic, but we need to document everything while it's fresh. Are you willing to provide a formal statement?" "Absolutely," Aaliyah replied. "I want to ensure this never happens to another passenger." As she began writing her statement, Aaliyah's phone buzzed with a text from David Martinez, Meridian's head of corporate security. "Crisis team assembled. Legal standing by. Media monitoring active. Awaiting your instructions." The pieces were falling into place for a revelation that would shock everyone involved. But for now, Aaliyah continued playing her role as an ordinary passenger seeking justice through ordinary channels. The extraordinary truth would emerge soon enough. Samantha sat in a jump seat under the watchful eye of Agent Foster, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of her situation. 15 years of employment, gone. Potential federal criminal charges looming. Civil lawsuit, inevitable. Her life was unraveling in real time, and she still had no idea that the worst revelations were yet to come. As Flight MA447 began its final approach into Los Angeles International Airport, everyone aboard thought they understood the situation. A flight attendant had assaulted a passenger and would face the consequences. What none of them realized was that they were about to discover that the passenger they'd witnessed being attacked was actually the person who owned the airline, and that revelation would transform this incident from a simple assault case into a corporate earthquake that would reshape the entire industry. The plane touched down at LAX with a gentle bump, but the real impact was still to come. The moment Flight MA447 came to a complete stop at Gate 42B, the situation transformed from an in-flight incident to a major criminal investigation. FBI agents were waiting at the jet bridge, having been contacted by the air marshals during the final approach. What had started as a routine discrimination complaint was now a federal assault case with multiple witnesses and clear evidence. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had been called in from the FBI's Civil Rights Division, specializing in hate crimes and discrimination cases. At 41, she'd prosecuted dozens of similar cases, but rarely with such clear-cut evidence and so many credible witnesses. The video footage from passenger phones would make this case almost impossible to defend. Jennifer Walsh stood in the terminal, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as ground crews serviced the aircraft. She'd flown in from San Francisco on Aaliyah's private jet, bringing with her a team of lawyers, investigators, and crisis management specialists. The efficiency of their response would have impressed any corporate observer, but it also raised questions about why a simple passenger complaint warranted such high-level attention. David Martinez, Meridian's head of corporate security, arrived at the gate just as passengers began disembarking. A former FBI agent himself, he recognized the federal law enforcement presence immediately. What concerned him was that he still didn't know the identity of the assault victim, only that his boss had classified it as a crisis-level situation. Inside the aircraft, Aaliyah was providing her detailed statement to Agent Torres, while the investigation team photographed the scene and interviewed witnesses. Her account was methodical and precise, the product of a mind trained to analyze complex situations and communicate clearly under pressure. "Ms. Richardson," Agent Torres said as she reviewed the statement, "this appears to be a clear case of assault motivated by racial bias. Are you prepared to pursue federal charges?" "I'm prepared to pursue whatever charges ensure this never happens." Again, Aaliyah replied, "Not just to me but to any passenger." What Agent Torres didn't know was that the woman sitting across from her had the power to transform the entire airline industry's approach to discrimination. Aaliyah's identity remained protected for now, but the revelation was approaching rapidly. Samantha was escorted off the aircraft in handcuffs, a perp walk that was captured by multiple passenger phones and would soon go viral on social media. Her attorney, hastily contacted by her union representative, was already advising her to remain silent until they could assess the strength of the evidence against her. Marcus Thompson found himself in the uncomfortable position of being both a witness and a potential defendant in the investigation. His testimony would be crucial to establishing the pattern of discriminatory behavior, but he also faced scrutiny for his failure to intervene more forcefully earlier in the incident. "Officer, I need you to understand something," Marcus told Agent Torres during his interview. "This wasn't an isolated incident. I've seen this pattern before with Samantha. She treats black passengers differently, and management has ignored complaints about it." This revelation transformed the investigation from a simple assault case into a potential pattern and practice civil rights violation. If Marcus's allegations were true, Meridian Airlines could be facing federal oversight and massive legal liability. As the investigation expanded, Jennifer Walsh coordinated with David Martinez to prepare for Aaliyah's eventual revelation of her identity. They decided to let the initial investigation proceed normally, gathering evidence of how the airline's own security team would handle a discrimination case involving an unknown passenger. "David," Jennifer said quietly as they watched the FBI agents working, "how long before someone realizes who she is?" "Depends on how thorough their background check is," David replied. "Her ID shows her real name, but it might take them a while to connect it to the airline ownership." The answer came sooner than expected. Agent Torres was running a routine background check on all parties involved when Aaliyah's name triggered multiple alerts in the FBI's database. Not criminal alerts, but security clearance notifications related to her various government contracts through her tech companies. "Ma'am," Agent Torres approached Aaliyah with a puzzled expression, "I need to verify some information. According to our records, you hold multiple federal security clearances. Can you confirm your occupation?" Aaliyah paused, recognizing that the moment of truth was approaching. "I'm the founder and CEO of Richardson Technologies, and I have several other business interests." Agent Torres's eyes widened as she made the connection. Richardson Technologies was one of the largest AI companies in the world, with contracts throughout the federal government. The woman who'd been assaulted by a flight attendant was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in America. "Other business interests," Agent Torres repeated slowly. "Would those include any involvement with airlines?" The question hung in the air as David Martinez approached their conversation area. He'd been monitoring the investigation from a distance, but now it was time to coordinate the revelation that would change everything. "Agent Torres," David said, presenting his credentials. "I'm David Martinez, head of corporate security for Meridian Airlines. I believe you're investigating an incident involving one of our crew members." "Yes, we are," Agent Torres confirmed. "Are you here to provide additional information about the employee in question?" David glanced at Aaliyah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'm here because the victim of this assault is Dr. Aaliyah Richardson, who happens to be the owner of Meridian Airlines." The revelation hit Agent Torres like a physical blow. She'd been investigating an assault on a passenger, but the passenger owned the airline. The legal, regulatory, and public relations implications were staggering. "The owner," Agent Torres repeated, looking between Aaliyah and David. "You own the airline where this happened?" "Through various holding companies, yes," Aaliyah confirmed. "I was traveling incognito to observe operations. I never expected to become the victim of the exact type of discrimination I was trying to identify and eliminate." The irony was devastating and perfect. Aaliyah had been conducting a secret investigation into discrimination complaints only to become the victim of the worst incident in the airline's history. The employee who'd assaulted her had been attacking her own ultimate boss, the person who could fire every executive in the company with a single phone call. Agent Torres realized that this case had just become the highest-profile civil rights investigation of her career. When the media learned that a billionaire airline owner had been assaulted by her own employee, the story would dominate news cycles for weeks. "Dr. Richardson," Agent Torres said carefully, "this revelation significantly changes the scope of our investigation. We'll need to examine whether this incident represents broader patterns of discrimination within your airline." "That's exactly what I want," Aaliyah replied. "I want a comprehensive federal investigation that ensures this never happens again, not just at Meridian, but throughout the industry." As word of Aaliyah's identity began spreading through the airport security network, the investigation transformed from a routine assault case into a potential industry-changing event. The woman who'd been slapped by a racist flight attendant wasn't just seeking personal justice. She had the power and resources to transform the entire system. The most shocking revelation was yet to come. When the media learned this story, it wouldn't just be about one incident of discrimination. It would be about how one moment of hatred had given the victim the perfect opportunity to revolutionize an entire industry's approach to civil rights. The Meridian Airlines corporate headquarters in downtown Los Angeles erupted into controlled chaos as news of the incident reached the executive suites. CEO Michael Stevens was in the middle of a quarterly budget meeting when his assistant burst through the conference room doors with unprecedented urgency. "Mr. Stevens, we have a situation that requires immediate attention," she announced, her voice barely concealing panic. "There's been an incident on flight MA447, and Dr. Richardson wants an emergency board meeting in 1 hour." Michael Stevens felt his blood pressure spike. In his 5 years as CEO of Meridian Airlines, Aaliyah Richardson had never called an emergency meeting. She was the most hands-off owner he'd ever worked with, preferring to let management handle day-to-day operations while she focused on her tech empire. For her to demand immediate board attention meant something catastrophic had occurred. "What kind of incident?" Stevens asked, already mentally calculating potential damage scenarios. "I don't have details yet, but it involves a passenger complaint and potential federal investigation," the assistant replied. Dr. Richardson specifically requested that David Martinez brief the board on a critical discrimination incident. Stevens dismissed the budget meeting and called an emergency assembly of Meridian's board of directors. Within 45 minutes, 12 of the most powerful executives in the airline industry were seated around the mahogany conference table in the 42nd floor boardroom, none of them knowing they were about to hear the most shocking revelation of their careers. David Martinez entered the boardroom carrying a thick folder of incident reports and witness statements. His expression was grave as he surveyed the assembled executives, knowing that his next words would trigger the biggest crisis in the airline's history. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, 2 hours ago on flight MA447 from Atlanta to Los Angeles, one of our flight attendants physically assaulted a first-class passenger. The assault was unprovoked, racially motivated, and witnessed by multiple passengers who recorded the incident. The board members exchanged concerned glances, but this still seemed manageable. Airlines dealt with personnel issues regularly, and even serious ones could usually be contained with proper crisis management. "The employee has been arrested by federal agents and will face criminal charges," David continued. "The passenger is pursuing both criminal and civil action, and the FBI's Civil Rights Division has opened a formal investigation." Chief Financial Officer Patricia Wong raised her hand. "David, while this is certainly serious, why are we having an emergency board meeting? Shouldn't this be handled through normal HR and legal channels?" David paused, knowing that his next words would detonate like a bomb in the room. Because the passenger who was assaulted is Dr. Aaliyah Richardson. The silence that followed was absolute. 12 successful executives sat frozen, their minds struggling to process the implications of what they'd just heard. Their owner, the woman who controlled their careers and the company's future, had been physically attacked by one of their employees. "That's impossible," Stevens finally whispered. "Dr. Richardson doesn't travel on commercial flights. She has private jets." "She was conducting an undercover investigation of customer service complaints," David explained. "She'd been receiving reports of discriminatory treatment and wanted to observe operations firsthand. Instead, she became the victim of the worst incident in our airline's history." Board member James Crawford, head of operations, leaned forward with evident concern. "How bad is the evidence?" David opened his folder and distributed copies of witness statements, FBI reports, and still frames from passenger videos showing Aaliyah with a clear handprint on her face. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "It gets worse," David continued. "The flight attendant, Samantha Chen, has a documented history of complaints about discriminatory behavior. Marcus Thompson, our senior flight attendant on that flight, has provided testimony about a pattern of racial bias that management has ignored. The legal implications began hitting the board members like falling dominoes. Federal investigation, civil rights violations, massive financial liability, regulatory sanctions, stock price collapse. The potential consequences were catastrophic. At that moment, the boardroom doors opened, and Aaliyah Richardson entered. She still wore the clothes from her flight, and the faint mark on her cheek was visible under the conference room lighting. The most powerful executives in the airline industry stood respectfully, but the atmosphere was thick with tension and embarrassment. "Please sit down," Aaliyah said calmly, taking her seat at the head of the table. "I'm sure David has briefed you on what happened." Stevens cleared his throat nervously. "Dr. Richardson, we're absolutely horrified by this incident. We want you to know that we'll take immediate action to address the situation and ensure it never happens again." "Will you?" Aaliyah asked, her voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. "Because according to the evidence I've gathered, this wasn't an isolated incident. This was part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that your management team has been aware of and chosen to ignore." She gestured to David, who distributed additional documents showing complaint histories, disciplinary records, and customer service reports that painted a damning picture of systematic discrimination throughout the airline. Samantha Chen had received 17 complaints about discriminatory behavior in the past 3 years, Aaliyah continued. 17 complaints that your HR department classified as customer service issues rather than civil rights violations. How do you explain that? The board members squirmed uncomfortably, realizing that their negligence had created a massive liability exposure. They'd treated discrimination complaints as minor customer service problems, never recognizing the legal and financial risks they were accumulating. "Furthermore," Aaliyah said, her voice growing stronger, "I've reviewed our company's training materials, hiring practices, and disciplinary procedures. We have been systematically failing to address discrimination, creating a hostile environment for minority passengers and employees alike." The revelations kept coming, each one more damaging than the last. Aaliyah had used her position as owner to access internal documents that revealed widespread problems throughout the organization. The assault she'd suffered wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable result of a corporate culture that tolerated discrimination. "Dr. Richardson," CFO Patricia Wong asked carefully, "what are you planning to do about this situation?" Aaliyah looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member before responding. "I'm planning to use this incident as an opportunity to completely transform not just our airline, but the entire industry's approach to civil rights and equality." The scope of her vision was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. This wasn't going to be a quiet settlement and policy adjustment. This was going to be a public reckoning that would reshape aviation industry standards. "Tomorrow morning," Aaliyah announced, "I'm holding a press conference to discuss this incident and announce comprehensive reforms to our operations. I'm also establishing a $50 million fund to support discrimination victims and civil rights organizations. The financial commitment alone was staggering, but the public relations implications were even more significant. When the story broke that an airline owner had been assaulted by her own employee, it would become international news and force industry-wide examination of discrimination practices. Stevens realized that his job, and the jobs of everyone in the room, were hanging by a thread. Dr. Richardson, how can we best support your vision for moving forward? By recognizing that this incident has given us an unprecedented opportunity, Aaliyah replied. We can lead the industry in creating truly equitable treatment for all passengers and employees, or we can be forced to change by federal intervention and public pressure. The choice is yours. The message was clear. Embrace transformation willingly, or be dragged through it by external forces. For the executives around the table, it was an easy choice to make, even if implementing it would be the challenge of their careers. As the meeting concluded, everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in aviation history. The slap that Samantha Chen had delivered in anger was about to become the catalyst for the most comprehensive civil rights reforms the airline industry had ever seen. Do you think Aaliyah's response represents the right balance between justice and transformation? Comment number 1 if you believe her approach will create lasting change, or number 2 if you think she should have handled this privately. If you're amazed by how one moment of injustice is about to reshape an entire industry, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and redemption. But here's the question that's going to keep you watching. How will the public react when they learn that a billionaire was assaulted by her own employee? And what will happen to Samantha when she discovers the true identity of the woman she attacked? The answer will shock you more than anything we've revealed so far. The morning of the press conference dawned gray and overcast in Los Angeles, but inside the Meridian Airlines corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Aaliyah Richardson stood before her bathroom mirror, carefully applying concealer to the fading bruise on her cheek. She could have let it show, using the visible evidence of assault for maximum impact, but she preferred to let her words carry the weight of the message rather than relying on sympathy. At 8 a.m., exactly 12 hours after the incident, news of the assault began breaking across social media platforms. Passenger videos from Flight MA447 had gone viral overnight, showing the aftermath of Samantha's attack and Aaliyah's composed response to being struck. The hashtag Meridian Assault was trending worldwide, but the public still didn't know the most shocking part of the story. Samantha Chen woke up in a Los Angeles County jail cell, having spent the night in custody after being denied bail due to the federal nature of the charges. Her court-appointed attorney had tried to explain the severity of her situation, but she remained convinced that she was the victim of an elaborate setup. It wasn't until she saw the morning news that the true magnitude of her situation began to dawn on her. Breaking news this morning, announced CNN anchor Anderson Cooper. Federal authorities have arrested a Meridian Airlines flight attendant for assaulting a passenger during a cross-country flight. Multiple witnesses recorded the incident, which appears to have been racially motivated. We're joined now by our aviation correspondent, who has been following this developing story. The coverage was extensive, but incomplete. News outlets had the assault story, the arrest, and the passenger videos, but they didn't yet know that the victim owned the airline. That revelation was scheduled for the 10 a.m. press conference, and it would transform a significant news story into a global media sensation. Inside Meridian's Crisis Management Center, a team of 20 communication specialists monitored social media, traditional news outlets, and stock market reactions in real time. The company's stock price had already dropped 8% in pre-market trading based solely on the assault story. When Aaliyah's identity became public, the financial impact would be catastrophic. Dr. Richardson, Jennifer Walsh approached with the latest media monitoring report. We're seeing massive public support for you personally, but growing calls for boycotts of Meridian Airlines. The public perception is that this represents systemic problems with the company culture. They're right, Aaliyah replied simply. This does represent systemic problems. That's exactly why we're having this press conference. At 9:30 a.m., Aaliyah's legal team received a frantic call from Samantha's attorney. requesting an immediate meeting to discuss settlement options. The lawyer had finally connected the dots between his client's victim and the airline ownership, realizing that Samantha had committed the most career-destroying assault in aviation history. Ms. Chen is prepared to issue a full public apology and submit to whatever sensitivity training you require, the attorney pleaded during the hastily arranged phone conference. She recognizes that her behavior was completely inappropriate and wants to make amends. Aaliyah listened to the settlement offer with detached interest. Please tell Ms. Chen that her apology is noted, but this incident has moved far beyond personal grievances. This is now about transforming an entire industry. The rejection of a private settlement sent shockwaves through Samantha's legal team. They'd assumed that any reasonable person would prefer a quiet resolution to a public legal battle. They hadn't anticipated dealing with someone who saw this incident as an opportunity to create systematic change rather than simply seeking personal vindication. At exactly 10 a.m., Aaliyah walked into the packed press conference room at Meridian's headquarters. 200 journalists, camera crews, and aviation industry representatives filled every available seat, with overflow crowds watching via live stream. The energy in the room was palpable as reporters sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Good morning, Aaliyah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. Yesterday, I was physically assaulted by a Meridian Airlines employee while traveling as a passenger in first class. The assault was unprovoked, racially motivated, and witnessed by dozens of passengers who recorded the incident. The room buzzed with anticipation, but the biggest revelation was still coming. What makes this incident particularly significant, Aaliyah continued, is that I am the owner of Meridian Airlines. The employee who attacked me was, in effect, assaulting her ultimate boss while providing exactly the type of discriminatory service I'd been investigating. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes erupted like lightning, and the noise level in the room became deafening. The story had just transformed from a serious incident into the most shocking corporate scandal of the year. Furthermore, Aaliyah said, raising her voice to be heard over the commotion, our investigation has revealed that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that our management team failed to address adequately. She spent the next 45 minutes detailing the evidence of systematic discrimination, announcing comprehensive policy reforms, and explaining her $50 million commitment to civil rights organizations. The presentation was methodical, devastating, and completely transparent about the airline's failures. When the press conference ended, the global reaction was swift and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for Aaliyah's courage in going public rather than settling quietly. Civil rights organizations praised her commitment to systematic change rather than personal compensation. Aviation industry executives began emergency meetings to review their own discrimination policies, terrified of facing similar scrutiny. But the most dramatic reaction came from Samantha Chen herself. Watching the press conference from her jail cell, she finally understood the true scope of what she had done. She hadn't just assaulted a passenger. She had attacked one of the most powerful women in America while providing exactly the type of service that would destroy her company's reputation. The irony was perfect and devastating. In trying to put a black woman in her place, Samantha had instead elevated her to a position of moral authority that would transform an entire industry. The slap that was meant to humiliate had instead become the catalyst for the most comprehensive civil rights reforms in aviation history. As news of the press conference spread around the world, one thing became clear. Aaliyah Richardson had taken the worst day of her professional life and transformed it into an opportunity to create lasting change for millions of travelers. The flight attendant who thought she was teaching a lesson about power had instead provided the perfect demonstration of what real power looked like when used for justice. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity as Representative Alexandria Williams, chair of the House Subcommittee on Aviation, called the emergency session to order. 2 weeks had passed since Aaliyah's press conference, and the public demand for accountability had reached a fever pitch that Congress could no longer ignore. This hearing will examine discriminatory practices in the airline industry, Representative Williams announced, with particular focus on the incident involving Dr. Aaliyah Richardson and the systematic failures that allowed such behavior to persist. Aaliyah sat at the witness table, flanked by her legal team and representatives from civil rights organizations. Across the room, Marcus Thompson prepared to give testimony that would expose decades of discrimination he'd witnessed, but been powerless to stop. The hearing would be broadcast live on all major networks, ensuring that millions of Americans would witness this unprecedented examination of aviation industry practices. Dr. Richardson, Representative Williams began, "Can you walk us through the events of that day and explain how this incident reflects broader problems in your industry?" Aaliyah's testimony was comprehensive and damning. She detailed not just her personal experience, but the systematic review of complaint patterns, training deficiencies, and management failures that had created an environment where discrimination could flourish unchecked. "The assault I suffered was horrific," Aaliyah testified, "but it was also predictable given the culture of tolerance for discriminatory behavior that existed throughout our organization. We failed our passengers, our employees, and our responsibility to treat all people with dignity and respect." The hearing room fell silent as she described the pattern of complaints against Samantha Chen, the inadequate training programs, and the management decisions that prioritized avoiding liability over addressing discrimination. Meanwhile, in a television studio across town, Samantha Chen was making her first public appearance since the incident. She'd been released on bail pending trial, but her life had been completely destroyed by the revelation of her victim's identity. Death threats, unemployment, and social isolation had replaced her 15-year airline career. "I want to apologize to Dr. Richardson and to everyone who was hurt by my actions," Samantha said during the interview with a local news station. "I was wrong, and I take full responsibility for what happened." But her apology was immediately undercut by her attempt to justify her behavior. "I want people to understand that I was under a lot of stress that day, and I felt threatened by her aggressive behavior. Sometimes people don't understand that flight attendants have to maintain order and safety." The interviewer pressed her on the racial aspects of the incident. "Multiple witnesses said you made racially charged comments. Do you acknowledge that race played a role in your actions?" Samantha's response revealed the depth of her denial. "I treat all passengers the same way. I don't see color. If she hadn't been so confrontational and threatening, none of this would have happened." The interview was a disaster for any remaining sympathy Samantha might have received. Her inability to acknowledge the racial motivation behind her actions, combined with her continued blame shifting, only reinforced public perception that she represented exactly the type of unconscious bias that plagued the industry. Back at the congressional hearing, Marcus Thompson was providing devastating testimony about the corporate culture that had enabled Samantha's behavior. "In my 12 years with Meridian Airlines," Marcus testified, "I witnessed hundreds of incidents where black passengers were treated differently than white passengers, questioned more aggressively, searched more thoroughly, seated separately from their families, and generally made to feel unwelcome." "And when you reported these incidents?" Representative Williams asked. "I was told that customer service complaints were normal and that I should focus on my own job performance rather than criticizing my colleagues," Marcus replied. The message was clear. Discrimination complaints weren't taken seriously. The hearing revealed a culture of willful blindness that extended far beyond one employee's racist behavior. Management had systematically ignored warning signs, minimized complaints, and prioritized operational efficiency over civil rights compliance. Dr. Patricia Williams, a civil rights expert from Howard University, provided context for how Aaliyah's case fit into broader patterns of discrimination in transportation industries. "What we see in the Meridian case is a textbook example of how individual prejudice combines with institutional indifference to create systematic discrimination," Dr. Williams testified. "The employee's assault was shocking, but the management's failure to address previous complaints was equally damaging." As the hearing progressed, other airline executives were called to testify about their own policies and procedures. The scrutiny was intense and embarrassing, as company after company was forced to admit that their anti-discrimination training was inadequate and their complaint processes were ineffective. The most powerful moment came when Aaliyah was asked about her response to those who criticized her for going public rather than settling privately. Some people have suggested that I should have handled this quietly to avoid damaging the airline industry, Aaliyah replied. But staying quiet would have meant that future passengers would continue to face the same discrimination I experienced. My responsibility isn't just to my company, or even to myself. It's to every person who deserves to travel with dignity and respect. The hearing concluded with Representative Williams announcing legislation that would require mandatory bias training for all transportation employees, independent oversight of discrimination complaints, and significant financial penalties for companies that failed to address discriminatory behavior. The Meridian incident has shown us that voluntary compliance is insufficient, Representative Williams declared. We need legal requirements and meaningful enforcement to ensure that what happened to Dr. Richardson never happens to anyone else. As the hearing ended, public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Aaliyah's approach and widespread demand for industry-wide reforms. The congressional testimony had transformed her from a victim seeking justice into a leader driving systematic change. Samantha Chen, watching the hearing from her apartment, finally began to understand the magnitude of what she had set in motion. Her moment of rage had triggered a national conversation about discrimination, led to federal legislation, and positioned her victim as a civil rights hero. The irony was complete. By trying to humiliate a black woman, she had instead elevated her to a position of moral authority that would benefit millions of people. The flight attendant who thought she was enforcing social hierarchy had instead become the catalyst for destroying it. And the passenger she'd tried to put in her place was now using that platform to ensure that no one would ever face such treatment again. 5 years after the incident that shook the aviation industry, Dr. Aaliyah Richardson stood before the graduating class of the newly established Meridian Aviation Civil Rights Institute. The state-of-the-art facility, built with funds from her Discrimination Victims Foundation, had become the premier training center for airline employees worldwide. When I was struck by that flight attendant 5 years ago, Aaliyah addressed the diverse group of trainees. I had a choice. I could have settled quietly, taken my compensation, and moved on with my life. Instead, I chose to use that moment of hatred as a catalyst for transformation. The graduates before her represented the success of that transformation. The Institute had trained over 10,000 airline employees in unconscious bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and cultural sensitivity. Airlines across the globe now sent their staff to Meridian for certification, making it the gold standard for equality training in transportation. Marcus Thompson, now the Institute's director, watched proudly from the front row. His decision to testify honestly about Samantha's behavior had cost him his original career, but given him a new purpose. Under his leadership, the Institute had expanded beyond aviation to serve bus companies, cruise lines, and other transportation providers. The ripple effects of speaking truth to power, Marcus often told his trainees, extend far beyond the immediate situation. My testimony helped create this institution, which has now touched hundreds of thousands of lives. The legal consequences for Samantha Chen had been severe, but not vindictive. She'd been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, followed by 3 years of community service working with diversity training programs. The experience had been genuinely transformative, forcing her to confront the unconscious biases that had driven her behavior. Now working as a counselor for the Reformed Bias Project, a program that helped former perpetrators of discrimination understand and change their behavior, Samantha had become an unlikely voice for redemption and personal growth. I was raised in an environment where certain assumptions about race and class were never questioned, Samantha explained to groups of airline employees during mandatory sensitivity training sessions. I thought I wasn't racist because I didn't use slurs or join hate groups, but I carried unconscious biases that led me to treat people differently based on their race, and those biases eventually erupted into violence. Her presentations were powerful precisely because she didn't minimize her actions or claim to be a victim herself. She accepted full responsibility for the assault while helping others recognize similar patterns in their own thinking. The financial impact on Meridian Airlines had been severe initially, with stock prices dropping 30% in the immediate aftermath of the scandal. However, Aaliyah's commitment to transparency and reform had eventually restored public confidence. The airline was now recognized as the industry leader in customer service and equality, with customer satisfaction scores that consistently ranked highest in the nation. The federal legislation triggered by Aaliyah's congressional testimony had transformed the entire transportation industry. The Civil Rights in Transportation Act required annual bias training for all employees, independent oversight of discrimination complaints, and significant financial penalties for companies that failed to address discriminatory behavior. More importantly, the law established a private right of action that allowed victims to sue not just individual employees, but the companies that failed to prevent discrimination. This provision had led to over 200 successful lawsuits in the past 5 years, creating powerful financial incentives for airlines to address bias proactively rather than reactively. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had testified at the original congressional hearing, was now conducting a comprehensive study of discrimination in transportation. Her preliminary findings showed a 70% reduction in discrimination complaints across all airlines since the implementation of the new federal requirements. The Meridian incident created a watershed moment, Dr. Williams explained in her interim report. It demonstrated that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong but financially catastrophic for companies that tolerated it. International airlines had also adopted similar standards, with the International Air Transport Association implementing global guidelines based on the reforms pioneered at Meridian. The incident that had started with one flight attendant's racist assumptions had literally changed how airlines operated worldwide. As Aaliyah concluded her speech to the graduating trainees, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. "I never wanted to become a civil rights advocate," she admitted. "I was content running my tech companies and quietly owning an airline. But sometimes life gives you experiences that demand more from you than you planned to give." The transformation hadn't been limited to the aviation industry. Aaliyah's approach to addressing discrimination through transparency, accountability, and systematic reform had been adopted by companies in healthcare, hospitality, and retail. Her memoir, Turbulence: How One Moment Changed Everything, had become required reading in business schools nationwide. The book's final chapter focused on forgiveness and redemption, acknowledging that while Samantha's actions had been inexcusable, her genuine efforts at reform and education had contributed to preventing similar incidents. "Transformation requires accountability," Aaliyah wrote, "but it also requires the possibility of redemption for those willing to do the hard work of changing themselves." As the graduation ceremony concluded, Aaliyah was approached by a young, Black woman who introduced herself as Captain Jennifer Hayes, the youngest pilot in Meridian's fleet. "Dr. Richardson," Captain Hayes said, "I wanted to thank you personally. Because of what you did 5 years ago, I've never experienced discrimination during my career with Meridian. Your courage to speak out created a workplace where I can focus on flying rather than fighting for respect." These individual stories multiplied across the industry, representing the true measure of Aaliyah's success. Thousands of employees and millions of passengers now traveled in an environment where discrimination was not tolerated, where complaints were taken seriously, and where equality was more than just a slogan in a corporate manual. The slap that Samantha Chen had delivered in anger had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive civil rights reforms in transportation history. The flight attendant who had tried to humiliate a passenger had instead provided her victim with the platform to transform an entire industry. As Aaliyah drove home that evening, she passed billboards advertising Meridian's latest campaign, "Every passenger, every flight, every time." The slogan represented more than marketing copy. It embodied a commitment to equality that had been forged in a moment of crisis and sustained through years of determined effort. The woman who had been struck for the crime of flying, while Black, had used that experience to ensure that no one else would face such treatment. The incident that was meant to diminish her had instead elevated her voice to heights that could benefit millions of people. In the end, justice hadn't just been served. It had been transformed into a force for systematic change that would protect future generations of travelers from the discrimination that had once been considered an acceptable part of air travel. This extraordinary story teaches us profound lessons about power, prejudice, and transformation. First, assumptions based on race or appearance can lead to catastrophic consequences for both perpetrators and organizations. Samantha's unconscious, Bias blinded her to the reality that success and wealth exist across all racial boundaries. Second, true leadership emerges not from avoiding difficult situations, but from using them as catalysts for positive change. Aaliyah could have settled quietly, but instead chose transparency and systematic reform that benefited millions. The story demonstrates that individual acts of discrimination reflect broader organizational failures. Marcus's testimony revealed that management's willful blindness enabled toxic behavior to flourish unchecked. Most importantly, we learn that justice isn't just about punishment, but about prevention. Aaliyah's approach combined accountability with education, creating lasting change rather than temporary satisfaction. Personal transformation is possible, as shown by Samantha's journey from perpetrator to educator. However, redemption requires genuine acknowledgement of harm, sustained effort to change, and commitment to helping others avoid similar mistakes. Finally, this story proves that one person's courage to speak truth to power can create ripple effects that transform entire industries and protect countless future victims from experiencing similar injustices. What strikes you most about Aaliyah's journey from victim to industry transformer? Do you believe her approach of combining accountability with opportunities for redemption represents the best path forward for addressing workplace discrimination? Comment below and share whether you think transparency or private settlements better serve justice in discrimination cases. If this incredible story of turning hatred into hope inspired you to think differently about confronting prejudice in your own life, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful true stories of courage and transformation. Share this video with friends and family who need to understand how one person's refusal to stay silent can create waves of positive change that protect millions of others. Thank you for joining me on this remarkable journey that proves justice delayed is not always justice denied when it becomes justice multiplied. Remember that each of us has the power to stand up against discrimination and create systematic change in our communities. Your voice matters, your courage counts, and your commitment to equality can make a difference that echoes through generations. Keep fighting for what's right, and never underestimate the power of truth to transform the world.